All right, this is your host of Psyphilopod, which is coming out of a state of dormancy, and I'm
Oh,
co-opting it for
yeah, I
my
was gonna
own
say new
purposes.
pilot right now.
Yeah, just taking over. Benjamin Winegard, assistant professor at Hillsdale College, and today's co-host slash special guest. I don't know how special of a guest, but
Per usual, Bo Winegard, former assistant professor at a small college in an undisclosed location in the Midwest. Corey Clark will also, who was the co-creator of this, will also appear from time to time as we resurrect what some people thought was a defunct podcast, but it's not.
uh, yeah, and just as also a note, there's not really any evidence that you ever had employment. So
That's true.
we can't
That's
confirm.
true. My employment has not been confirmed.
There are rumors that you were actually never employed and you faked your own firing to gain culture war cred.
That was one rumor. Another rumor was I was actually employed and engineered my own termination to get victim cred. That was another theory that I like.
Clearly, one of the two of those is accurate. Um,
Yes.
so
Enough of our indulgent reflections. What are we doing here today?
So today we're going to talk about evolutionary psychology, intelligence, and the role that human nature plays, interaction between human nature and IQ and some other traits play in political conflict, tribalism, and negative polarization. And just to be clear, with the terminology, negative polarization specifically refers to a pattern where individuals hate, right, or feel affective loathing toward an out group, toward the
Well,
other political parties.
isn't it? I mean, wouldn't you say it's basically the way that an in group is kept together more by loathing of the out group than affinity for the in group?
Yeah, so importantly, there's this secular trend toward negative polarization. So if you look at survey data going back to the early 70s, you see that people's feelings of warmth for, if you're a Democrat, your feelings of warmth toward the Republican Party have been declining. But interestingly, your feelings of warmth for your own identified party, namely in this case, the Democratic Party, are stable. So
Right.
negative or affective polarization is then it's important to understand what it refers to, that it's not like people actually love their own political party more than they
Right.
did in the 1970s.
Right. And I think it's important to note that the hatred for the out group and the love or warmth toward the in group are, I don't want to say they're completely orthogonal, but they're largely orthogonal. And that's actually important for a number of reasons. So we'll just keep that in mind. So yeah, the basic idea is, let's look at uh, the forces or evolutionary analysis and what it can tell us about human nature, and
Mhm.
understanding human nature, or using our understanding of human nature to understand some features of politics.
Mhm.
Some of these are permanent features or relatively permanent features of politics, and some of them are unique to the modern West. And we think that understanding human nature can help illuminate some of the challenges that we face in the West.
Yes. So what is evolutionary psychology then, is and how is evolutionary psychology relevant to politics?
Right. So we start with evolutionary psychology. So evolutionary psychology is based on the simple premise that using Darwinian theory is a way to, or is one route to illuminating certain features of human nature.
Mhm.
So Charles Darwin, of course, forwarded the theory of evolution by natural selection and, importantly, sexual selection. And this theory is a very powerful theory for understanding human nature. And I always I I think it's easiest to understand evolution by considering what, 3 or 4 fundamental premises. I'm trying to remember. So you've got,
if you have 3 fundamental, like 3 key observations
right,
that inevitably lead to natural selection.
right? So
So that is variation.
yeah,
That is all organisms within the same species even vary somewhat.
within the same family even,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's just important to note
So
that
all organisms are different.
yes, no 2 organisms are exactly alike.
Mhm.
And then you have differential reproduction. So that is, you have variability, but specifically variability in the amount of offspring that you produce that survive and reproduce themselves.
Mhm.
And then heredity, that is, there is vertical or generational transfer of information from parent to offspring.
Right. So I say this, the way I put it is that offspring bear a non-random resemblance to their parents. And this
Mhm.
is important because if you don't have this, you can't, traits will just randomly appear and disappear from a population. So
Correct.
the beautiful thing about natural selection is that it's such an elegant theory, right? You just start with these 3 premises or observations or principles, whatever you want to call them. If you have these 3, you automatically get natural selection. That is, you get a non-random change in the distribution of traits, really the underlying distribution of alleles, but
Correct.
the phenotypic leads to different phenotypic expression in a population,
Mhm.
right? Automatically, you get natural selection. And the natural selection, importantly, although we might not go into this too much, I mean, maybe with some cultural evolution stuff, but natural selection is medium neutral. That is to say, we think about it and we think of genes and organisms, and we think it holds the key to understanding biological life. But anytime you have those 3 principles, right, that is variation, differential survival and reproduction, and heredity, you get natural selection. And if this happens in the sphere of culture, you get natural selection in culture as well.
Correct. So that's the basic gist of natural selection. And then you have sexual selection, which specifically refers to the non-random survival and reproduction of organisms based on their access, gaining access to mates, right?
Right.
To
So
fertilizations.
right. So it's the subset of selective processes that are related directly to mating behaviors. And
Mhm.
it's the reason it's important to make a distinction, I think, between those 2, or to focus on sexual selection sometimes, right? Is because some traits, obviously the most famous is the peacock's elaborate train. Some traits appear almost inexplicable from the perspective of natural selection. And in fact, Charles Darwin, I think it was in one of his letters that he wrote, he was sort of sickened every time he contemplated the peacock's tail, because if you just think about ability to survive and reproduce, you would think, why would you want such a huge, cumbersome tail? And
Mhm.
there is indeed evidence that the tail makes peacocks more vulnerable to predation. But if that tail helps the male reproduce more effectively, if females preferentially, in this case, peahens preferentially choose peacocks with large tails, then it can evolve and pass down. And that's a process, or that is a result of sexual selection. We
Right.
won't get into the complications about, well, what does the tail signal? Because that's not important.
No,
But it is important to note that certain traits that we couldn't understand otherwise, we can understand once we understand sexual selection.
and sexual selection is particularly important because it helps account for sexual dimorphism, both physically and psychologically.
Right. So dimorphism, just meaning differences, basically, right? So there are physical differences between males and females often. I mean, there have to be in reproductive, in eggs, otherwise you don't have males and females. But there are often physical differences in bodies, musculature, etc., and psychological differences.
Right. So evolutionary psychology then takes the twin Darwinian theories of natural and sexual selection and combines it with the kind of latest research, I'd say, in psychology, including neuroscience and importantly, cognitive psychology.
Right.
Right.
So yeah, so I think that was so shortly after Darwin's theory, right, people realized that that would have consequence for understanding human nature. And early psychologists, especially William James, I think, was one of the earliest who really took a functional approach, which is why he's described as a functionalist, and argued that we have to understand what the mind or the functions of the mind, the features of the mind, what they were designed to do. And importantly, James had the insight that humans don't have fewer, but rather more instincts than other animals, right? Because there's kind of this idea that the human mind is this all-purpose, flexible machine that just responds and adapts to stimuli. Whereas James argued, no, there are actually like a lot of like well-designed instincts.
Yes. And an example of functional analysis that's pretty straightforward would be, instead of just describing the phenomenology of a fear or when it is expressed, a functional analysis would say, why do you have that emotion to begin with, right? Why would it evolve? What is its function? How does it help the organism survive and reproduce?
Right, exactly. And so I think that that's the thing that you're doing with an evolutionary analysis is you're taking a psychological, like you're usually you're starting from an observation, but you can also work the other way. But often you would start with an observation. Hey, humans are sometimes afraid. And then you would think, what might the purpose function of fear be throughout evolutionary history? And the way you're doing that is you're asking, how would fear help an organism to survive and reproduce? Now, importantly, is say the genetic fitness, that is how many genes an organism leaves behind, going from, I mean, there are various ways of measuring it, from offspring to grandchildren, whatever. But the genetic fitness of an organism that doesn't reproduce, no matter how long it lives, is basically zero, right?
Is zero, yes.
Yeah. So you have both survive. That's why we say survive and reproduce, because surviving is important, but if you don't reproduce, it doesn't matter.
There's a caveat here that the inclusive fitness theory, if you help close relatives reproduce, even if you don't reproduce yourself, you can increase your fitness. I think that's a little, we don't really need to go into the weeds of that, but just note that. Go ahead.
Agreed, we don't, but it's important to note that natural selection, I think people have argued, and I think they're correct, that the best way to think about it is from the gene's point of view, right? Not from the organism's point of view. And this makes kin behavior explicable. Why would kin, that is brothers and sisters, parents and offspring, sacrifice so much for each other? Well, when you start to do the math and you look at what's the likelihood that a brother has the same gene that I have versus a stranger does, that's what allows you to understand why kin sacrifice for each other. Because if the gene in my body, and we're just going to make this dumb and simple, but if the gene in my body can somehow recognize itself in my brother's body and promote my brother's fitness, it's promoting its own fitness.
Right. And if you're thinking about inclusive fitness and sacrificing for brothers or sisters, also note that parental investment, really, right? Sacrificing for your offspring is
Right.
just a special case of inclusive fitness.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. From the gene's point of view, it doesn't make a difference.
Right. And we take parent offspring behavior for granted because it's such a part of our nature. So I think it's easiest to work from that and think, okay, sacrificing for brothers and sisters is really the same thing. It's the same logic as a parent sacrificing for children. It's about shared genetics. So evolutionary theory or evolutionary psychology, again, it takes this Darwinian heritage and it attempts to apply it to humans. And we don't need to get into like, are there thousands of modules or whatever, but I would say one of the premises of evolutionary psychology is the one that William James forwarded, except for evolutionary psychologists would put it in this more cognitive language, which is that the human mind / brain is not one system. We call it the brain and we think of it as one organ, but really they would say it is constituted of many organelles in some sense. That is, many parts of the brain mind are specifically adapted to deal with singular or specific challenges, right?
Yes, so they're domain specific.
Right.
And modular.
Right. So an example of this would be, for example, that there's a particular area called the fusiform gyrus that appears to be adapted to, there's debate about whether it's just specialized perception or if it's unique to the face, but it's definitely involved in face perception, which is something that humans are remarkably good at. We can distinguish between thousands upon thousands, really millions probably, of faces, and we're very good at recognizing faces, distinguishing them from other faces, and remembering them. And interestingly, you can have this ability interrupted if you have damage in the fusiform gyrus. You could become face blind. Prosapagnosia is what it's called, right? I think that's how you pronounce it. This is a disorder in which people are, despite having normal perceptual abilities, they are unable to perceive faces anymore.
Yeah.
So this would be an example of something that's modular, where you have this area of the brain that's devoted to solving a recurrent evolutionary challenge.
Yeah, and I'd say a more straightforward example would be the auditory system, right? So you could have damage to a specific area of your brain responsible for auditory processing, and it would injure your capacity to, let's say, process auditory information like language, but it wouldn't interfere with your ability to feel fear or hunger, for example.
Right.
So however the debate is resolved on modularity, it's clear that the brain does have subcomponents to it that are specialized and that process domain-specific information.
Right. I think this is important because I think people underestimate how many modules, or maybe not how many, but how this would work and how much of human life is compelled by, impelled by, and negotiated by processes that aren't conscious, right?
Yeah.
Finding a mate, finding food, being repulsed by food that's bad, right? Being disgusted by wounds. Like, you can go down a list, and all of these things, they're all, we are able to negotiate the world and these challenges because we have these adaptations, and we don't have to reflect on them rationally. We don't have to think, should I consume a decaying piece of meat? We're just disgusted by it and intuitively, automatically.
Yes, that is correct. So that's the kind of 101 evolutionary psychology. In order to understand human nature, you have to try to understand why what selective pressures humans faced and what adaptations were likely to evolve from those selective pressures.
Right, and I think maybe we just think of the simplest example. Why are humans so obsessed by sex, right? So evolutionary psychologists would look at that and say, okay, yes, like humans seem to be overwhelmingly preoccupied with sex. Why would that be the case? Well, clearly an organism that requires sexual reproduction to have offspring should want to sexually reproduce and should be very motivated to seek out opportunities to sexually to engage in sexual behavior, because on average that would lead to more offspring. So you imagine, well, what if a gene arose that caused utter disinterest in sex?
Yes.
Well, that gene wouldn't go very far, because the owner, quote unquote, the owner of that gene would not engage in sex, and that would be the end of the line for that gene. So that's like a good way just to think about this. And we can do this with fear. What would happen if you had a gene arise that caused the owner not to have fear? Well, they would probably die pretty quickly.
Right. Yes. You would not live a long, healthy life if you had no feeling of fear whatsoever.
Right.
So then we wanted to discuss, at least briefly, the evolution of intelligence and where that fits into the discussion.
Right. So I think it's interesting, because intelligence seems to be in some ways it contradicts the way evolutionary psychologists look at the mind brain, because much of their analysis is modular. We're looking at specific mental instincts, in whatever you want to call them, that deal with recurrent evolutionary problems. But general intelligence is this thing that actually seems domain general. That is, it's flexible. It's not designed to respond to one particular stimulus or another. In fact, it appears to be useful for a number of challenges. And in fact,
and I would just say, this is so much so the case that it's actually difficult to define intelligence, because it's so kind of broad and nebulous. So people have tried to define it as like the ability to learn, to process information, to synthesize information, to navigate the environment adaptively. And there's no universally agreed upon definition. In fact, the famous educational psychologist and IQ researcher Arthur Jensen went so far as to say we should just dispense with the term, right? It's not useful in science. It's kind of like phlogiston or something. Just stop talking about it.
I think that's going too far, because the word is clearly like the construct of IQ, the constructs of IQ, and then even more specifically G, are related to the everyday concept of intelligence. And I see no reason to scrap the term.
The way I would think about intelligence as being the mental analog of athleticism. Right.
I think that's a good way of looking at it. But so let's point out that this was discovered by Charles Spearman. At least the fact that what Spearman discovered is that if you were good, let's say in math class, you were more likely to be better than average in another class that seemed unrelated at first. So we have this there's this kind of stereotype of the person who's really good at math but terrible at language,
or vice versa,
or the lawyer who can't do addition. But the fact of the matter is that that's actually not true. If you gave me a person's score on like a rigorous math test, and let's say that score was 95 out of 100 or 95th percentile, I would make the prediction that they would be better than average on a language test. And more often than not, I would be correct, because these mental capacities are correlated. This is what Spearman discovered and called Spearman's G. So this is an important fact about the structure of human intelligence. That is to say, mental abilities are correlated.
Yes, they're positive, and this is known as the positive manifold. The fact that
Right.
scores on all kind of mental ability tests are positively correlated. Exactly what you said, namely that if I'm better than average at, say, like even musical pitch, I'm probably better than average at, say, three-dimensional mental rotation.
So the mental, the musical pitch even?
Yeah, in Spearmint studies,
I know Spearman found music was correlated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So basically, any test that seems to require effortful cognition
Right.
is going to be positively correlated with another test that seems to require effortful cognition.
Right. And this is why this is setting up because this is kind of abstract, maybe even abstruse. So it's good to make it concrete with what you said, which is athleticism. So just think about it this way. If you knew somebody was good at running hurdles, you would predict that they would also probably be good at throwing a javelin. That is at least better than average at throwing a javelin. And similarly, they'd be better than average at running a 40-yard dash, etc. There seems to be this thing, athleticism, that LeBron James has a lot of. He has a high amount of it, and I have a very low amount of it.
Right. So just concretely, if you think about it, I have no idea how fast LeBron James could do a freestyle 100-meter lap in a pool, but I'm 99.9% positive that he would be able to do that in a shorter time than I would, because he's just has a lot more athleticism, and that translates into basically the ability to efficiently move your body through space.
Yes, and so just as mental tasks, the ability to perform on mental tasks is correlated, so too is the ability to perform physical tasks. Throwing might be correlated with running, even although they seem as though they're sort of two separate activities. They're not entirely separate. Now, we're not getting into the weeds on this particular issue, but there's an interesting question arises, which is, why are they correlated? Is there one kind of underlying thing that causes them to be correlated, or are there multiple things, etc.? Ultimately there's something biological causing this, but we're not 100% sure what it is.
Right. And so then you have the question, so we know that we have this general intelligence factor, and we know that it's correlated with educational attainment, occupational status, etc. Then there's an additional question of, well, why did that evolve to begin with? What did it evolve? What's the function of having this domain general ability to learn and solve novel or evolutionarily novel problems?
Well, that's almost forwarding one hypothesis, isn't it?
Oh.
Which is that it helps you to solve. I mean, that's kind of the.
Well, it's indubitable that it helps you solve evolutionarily novel problems.
It is, but yeah. So there's this. Yes, there's a question like, I mean, clearly humans seem to be the intelligent animal par excellence, right? The very paragon of an intelligent creature. Clearly, we're much more intelligent than dogs and chimpanzees, etc. So why? What is it that led to the evolution of intelligence? And you forwarded I would say Satoshi Kanazawa is the thinker who's put it in the most like stark terms, right? Which is to say, intelligence evolved because it allows humans, evolved primates, particular primates, to solve evolutionarily novel problems. That is, problems that weren't recurrent features of the organism's environment. So a recurrent feature would be like deciding whether to eat food that is bad, or deciding whether a food is bad. Should you ingest the food or should you not ingest it?
Yes.
that's something that has been a problem for organisms for millions upon millions of years, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Whereas, how do you stay alive during a cold winter, let's say? That is not, I mean, it is a challenge that's recurrent in some sense, but once you hit some level of flexibility, it becomes a novel challenge, and there are novel challenges in the environment. Do you build shelter? How do you build shelter? Building a fire, hunting certain animals, right? Because
Storing foods.
storing foods, which is a novel behavior. So all of these kinds of novel challenges, and Kanazawa argues, the further you get from the sort of evolutionary environment that our ancestors evolved in for most of the period of their evolutionary history, the more intelligence you would expect, because you're confronted with more evolutionarily novel problems.
Yes. And one, I think, particularly acute evolutionarily novel problem that humans faced was other coalitions of humans, right?
Yes,
So
that
you,
is one argument. Yeah.
yeah. So if you have, you can imagine multiple competing, let's say, villages, right, which consist of multiple coalitions within the village. There's zero-sum conflict between them. And you have an evolutionary arms race, because if one village comes up with a certain strategy or tactic or technology, that puts pressure on another village to either adopt the technology or be able to counter the novel strategy.
Mhm.
And you can see that if you ask, well, what's the kind of evolutionarily stable strategy there? There isn't one, right? Because it's a zero-sum contest. So it's you just have to be better than the neighboring groups are.
Importantly, there's no stable strategy, because each group is always adapting, creating, and promulgating new technologies and new strategies. So there's no
Right.
way to, like, yeah. So the idea is, once you get an organism that's reasonably flexible,
Mhm.
we'll just call them humans, so we don't have to call them specific ancestors. Once humans become reasonably flexible, I can no longer instantiate some simplistic algorithm to predict your behavior or another human's behavior. So
Right.
now we're in this sort of competitive cycle in which your behavior changes to take advantage of me, mine changes to take advantage of you, and we keep building upon that intelligence and somewhat ability to be flexible.
Yeah, and
Increases.
and certain capacities also can be seen as having evolved partially in response to this. So, for example, possessing an acute theory of mind,
Right.
That is an understanding that other humans have intentions, thoughts, and desires. And that's helpful at allowing me to predict how another person or group of individuals is going to behave in a particular circumstance.
Also, importantly, understanding that other people can have wrong beliefs about the world, right?
Yeah.
Because one thing that you find in younger children is that they are incapable of grasping that a person could believe the wrong thing about the world. That creates the ability to lie and deceive. And a lot of tactics are based on deception.
Yes.
Appearing as if you're going to do one thing and then doing something different. And that takes advantage of the fact that you realize that the other coalition knows that you have goals and thinks you're doing one thing that you're actually not doing.
Right.
Another theory, and this will be the sort of the last major theory we talk about before applying this to politics. Another theory that organizes these disparate ideas and presents sort of a unified approach to the evolution of intelligence is some kind of cultural evolutionary theory, or the argument that humans are the cultural creature. And that's really the thing that led to the expanded brain and increased intelligence. Because what culture is, culture allows an organism flexibly to respond to the environment because it's creating these new implements. Now, importantly, humans don't lose, they don't have to reinvent culture every generation. So what we find in other organisms, chimpanzees, and maybe in cetaceans and other ocean dwelling animals, but I don't know enough about them to speak intelligently. We find that they have culture, right? So they create certain kinds of tools, and chimpanzees in one area behave a little bit differently from chimpanzees in another, or monkeys even, we find.
What, just to pause or step back here, would you say that the reasonable definition of culture would be the vertical and horizontal transmission of non-biological information?
Yes, that sounds good to me. That's kind of abstract.
Very abstract.
Basically, it's passing information that's potentially usable to change behavior or interact with the environment from parents to children, or from adults to young people, or from people to people. So that's vertical, is from one generation to another.
Right.
Horizontal is like, I teach you something or exchange information with you.
A very simple example of a cultural accoutrement would be, suppose you have one individual discovers that although this particular food is toxic, if you put it in fire for long enough,
right,
it becomes edible.
Right. So
that individual then can transmit that information to another individual, and then it will spread in your entire group.
Right. So the important thing, yes, it's good. So the important thing with human culture is that it doesn't have to be reinvented every generation.
Right.
It is,
which makes it progressive.
Yeah, exactly. It makes it progressive. It means that it's stored and then passed on each generation. So humans are born into a world in which there's a lot of information that's available from their forebears, their parents, and from people around them, peers as well. And the argument is, one of the things that the human brain is really good at doing is learning from peers and from adults. And it has these so learning requires flexible intelligence, and people with higher intelligence than other people are better able to learn. They learn more quickly, and they learn more complicated things. And we also know that humans have certain learning biases that are very noticeable. One of which is, so like a challenge is, well, from whom should I learn? That's a question that sort of evolution poses to a human who's a cultural creature. From whom should I learn? And one answer is, I should learn from people who are successful. Because if somebody's successful, that means they're probably doing something right. And whatever it is they're doing right, I should copy. And that's why we see that people who have high status, who are celebrities, for example, people are more likely to copy them than they are to copy other people. So that's just one example of what we would call a context learning bias. It's something that causes us to pay more attention to somebody and to copy their behavior more.
Right. So the idea then is that intelligent people absorb culture more rapidly than relatively unintelligent people. Also, importantly, intelligent people are better able to innovate culturally. So take, for example, like say two individuals who have both been trained, like they're both trained car mechanics. The individual who is more intelligent is more likely to figure out a novel way to, let's say, put an engine together that will give his or her car more horsepower. Than the less intelligent person, even if the less intelligent person understands like the basics of how to fix an engine.
Yes, that's a good point. So it's not just about the sort of learning of culture. It's also about one's ability to contribute to that culture in a way that creates innovations that are useful. And the reason that's important is because people who create useful innovations are, in some sense, they're lionized. They're looked up to by others, and they get status and all of the sort of rewards, the perquisites of status, which are generally reproductively good.
And I think another important point here is that because culture is progressive, if we look at 2020 and compare it to 1020 AD, culture is just much more complicated now than it was, right, at any given time in the past.
Yes, that's right.
And it's further removed from our environment of evolutionary adaptiveness.
Yeah, so and I think it's fair to say that some cultures are more complicated, and I don't mean this in a, this doesn't need to have like some sort of value connected to it, but it's just objectively the case, right? That some cultures are more complicated than other cultures, and
Correct.
some things inside a culture are more complicated than other things. So for example, calculus is incredibly complicated,
Right.
whereas learning to count to 4 or 5 and rudimentary addition is not complicated. So pretty much anybody can learn how to count to 5. This is a cultural device, by the way. Numbers are cultural implements, and they're very useful.
Or if you're taking like a more mundane example from daily life, compare the difference between, say, uh, the 1940s, when you would put your money in a local depository institution, get a small interest on it, to now where you have like multiple creditors that you owe money to, and you have multiple areas where you could invest your money, and you're trying to figure out actually like how to optimize your returns,
Right.
right? Like I
Right.
have a mortgage, a car payment, 2 credit card payments. I have a mutual fund I'm investing in, etc. So you can just see like daily life is more complicated now than it was in 1945 or in the United States.
Right. And people, so in general, what we would expect from this theory, which I think has a lot going for it, is that people who score higher on intelligence tests, or who are smarter, what we would colloquially say are smarter, will be better able than other people to learn culture quickly and to learn more complicated components of culture. Perhaps there's, I mean, what you would say is there's basically, and I think math is the best example here because it's the easiest to understand. Intelligence, not only does it sort of, I don't want to say determine, but it's predictive of how easy things will be to learn and how fast you can learn them, but also it will predict your limit of learning. So some people would never be able to learn like advanced calculus, and other people will be able to. And other things equal, intelligence scores will predict who will be able to learn advanced calculus and who won't be able to. I feel very confident in asserting that if you give me somebody's IQ score and it's 75, that person's not learning advanced calculus unless there's some very bizarre thing going on.
Right. That's exactly correct. And so then how this seems very unrelated to politics.
Right. So we have evolutionary theory, and then we have intelligence. How is this related to politics?
Yeah, cool. I can learn culture more
Right.
rapidly than somebody else.
Right. So what I think is important here is this gives us a picture of human nature. Evolutionary psychology, I think of as like, okay, that's sort of giving us a look at human nature, and intelligence is one really important part of human nature. And then when we start to think about politics, we ask, well, what is politics, right? So like, how did politics arise? What are you doing in politics? And how is that affected by, predicted by human nature?
Mhm.
So I would argue that a lot is affected by everything, in fact, is affected by human nature. And to understand politics, you have to understand human nature. And one of the things that's important about humans is that they are incredibly tribal creatures.
Yes.
What do I mean by that? I mean, they create in-groups and out-groups. They have affinity for their in-group, not necessarily antipathy for the out-group, but if you put the groups in competition for limited resources, then you will often get antipathy for the out-group.
Mhm.
And the way to think about politics is basically, it's a way for tribes to compete for limited resources, including, importantly, cultural status.
Right. So material resources, cultural status, and politics is basically the question of who gets what, right?
Yes, right. Putting it crudely, it's who gets what, and then a lot of it is about attempting to justify the who gets what. So because humans are coalitionary creatures, they form groups of actors who sacrifice their individual interest, at least temporarily or in part, for group interest, which ultimately help them, but they suppress in-group competition to a degree,
Mhm.
and they compete against other groups for resources, including, again, status. So if you think of the sort of simplest idea of politics in the United States, you have Democrats and Republicans fighting for interests and suppressing, to some degree, in-group competition,
Mhm.
cooperating with each other to get resources and cultural status that another coalition, either Democrats or Republicans, also wants and thinks they deserve and will compete for.
Yes, and they're promulgating narratives that justify their particular view of how resources and status should be distributed.
Right. So I think we should know these narratives are so, especially if you go back in history, right? I wonder if you could say there's a sort of general principle that there was less hypocrisy. Maybe that's not true, but competition was much more, in some ways, direct. You conquered groups,
Yes.
right? And so humans competed in coalitions. One coalition would often vanquish another, slaughter the men, or enslave them and take the women,
Mhm.
right? So the consequences of losing competitions throughout human history were rather dire, the fitness consequences.
Yes.
As humans, at least certain groups of humans, conquered more groups, they assimilated more groups, and they became bigger. The coalitions became larger and larger. So you had great empires, the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, where you had a lot of different disparate groups held together in one sort of political body, or one structure of politics, one
Yeah,
political
so you would
structure.
have these large polyglot empires, actually even polyreligious empires,
Right.
and
Yes.
you have strong forces of internal then dissension within these empires because you have multiple coalitions speaking different languages, worshiping different gods, etc.
Right.
And then a really important problem that you have to solve is, well, how do you hold this large group together?
Right.
And
Yeah,
so a lot
it's a
of the
good point. So I mean, there's like this fundamental tension, right? This is an important way to think about this, like from an evolutionary perspective, is the larger your coalition is, the more competitively effective you are.
yes,
Larger coalitions win in battles. This, you can look at this from chimpanzees, right? The
right.
best
So
predictor of chimpanzee victory is which group has more chimpanzees, male chimpanzees.
And importantly, the larger, more cohesive groups,
Yes.
especially, are
Right.
formidable.
Right. So, and people love to talk about the tactics of a general, and that's fun to look at. But if you want to predict who's going to win a war, tell me how many troops they have working with them, right?
Right.
That's going to be the number one predictor of who wins a coalitionary conflict. So that is a pressure that leads to bigger coalitions. However, as the coalition grows, the shared overlapping interest inside the coalition shrinks.
Declines. Yes.
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 So we have this cultural challenge. How do we create a big coalition and somehow keep it from breaking apart?
Yes. And so a lot of the narratives that I think developed around the period where you get empires had to do with creating some kind of universal sense of cohesion, whether that was like through big gods or like these monotheistic religions that would unify it, like Christianity, for example, would be a good example of a unifying narrative that would be able to hold together like the entire Roman Empire.
Well,
Right.
Romans weren't monotheistic even remotely, so it's not.
No, I mean the later Roman Empire. That
Yeah.
Clearly,
Yeah.
it was promulgated by, say, Theodosius purposely to unify the empire.
Right. So the idea here is that we have this political. So this is a political challenge. How do we respond to it? We respond to it with a cultural adaptation.
Mhm.
And this is an argument that's been forwarded by Noren Zion, among others, that perhaps one solution to this problem is the creation. And when we say this, we don't mean that some individual cynically contemplated, hey, if I create a monotheistic God who's all powerful, this will really help hold the group together. Rather, it's just the slow development of religious tendencies that humans have and religious ideas they have, that eventually you hit this idea of having this kind of very powerful head God, chief God, right?
Mhm.
The king of kings of the gods that everybody is supposed to submit and defer to.
Right.
And
And
that
then the head of the state is the closest person to
Right.
that god.
Right. So you almost think there's like this hierarchy from the god to the human who's sort of the closest to that god and therefore is the leader of the other human. So you get the hierarchy of deference from the god to the leader to the other people below the leader. And this holds the coalition together.
Right. Right. And so I guess moving to Democrats and Republicans then.
Right.
Just
2,000 years, 1,500 years later. But I mean, the point there, though, is just like we want to hold a coalition together. And now we do that via the nation state. The idea
Yes.
that there's this country to which we belong, and the people in the country, we owe them more loyalty than we owe people in another country. And that holds a coalition together.
Mhm.
But there's a lot of competition within the coalition. And a lot of this competition, it's not violent physical competition. You
Although
can't,
it often is. You get civil
it's-
war is quite common.
right, it certainly can be, but it's often ideological. That is
Right.
to say, you're attempting to justify a kind of distribution of resources morally, not through violence. You don't just slaughter people and take the resources. You say it's not fair to have resources distributed this way. We should have them distributed that way.
And in the United States, for a whole host of technical reasons, we basically have two coalitions that compete to adjudicate how we should distribute resources and what narrative should reign supreme.
Right.
And that would be the Democratic Party and the Republican Party.
Right. I mean, in different countries, you have more coalitions, but then those coalitions have to work together to form super coalitions to battle against other coalitions.
Right.
So I think the first important thing that evolutionary theory makes clear And that I think is really helpful about taking evolutionary theory seriously for politics is that conflict is an ineradicable, conflict and competition are ineradicable components of any human society, because there's simply no stable strategy in evolution that would get rid of competition. So imagine this. You have 5 people in a group who are perfectly 100% altruistic and cooperative with each other. And you might think, well, that would be great, even biologically. Why would that be bad? They can all cooperate and enhance each other's fitness. Problem is, what happens if a mutation arises that causes a person to act as though they're cooperating, but actually to cheat, steal resources, sleep with other people's wives, etc.? Well, that person would do better, right? Because ultimately their fitness would be higher, right?
Yes. So everybody, all humans care about resources and status. And to some extent, it's a non-zero sum game.
Right. And importantly, any kind of pure altruism, 100% cooperation, any strategy like that loses to other strategies, right? There's just there's simply no way for that kind of a strategy to evolve. And therefore, what one would expect is that human society is going to be rife with conflict. And the best you can hope for is largely to suppress the conflict. You're not going to get rid of it. And so any political idea that's based on the notion of a society without conflict or with very minimal conflict is wrong. I mean, it's simply a fantasy that we could never enact.
Yeah, so then we have 2 outstanding questions still. Why does IQ matter, and what about increasing negative polarization?
Well, and also that we'll attempt to use these ideas to possibly to explain the rise of populism in the United States and think about that from these perspectives. So evolutionary theorists would argue political conflict is ineradicable. And the way to think about politics is to think about its coalitionary conflict, right? And then so we think about, well, how do these what is the nature of these coalitions, and why do you get different coalitions? And that's where I think we both think that IQ is an important part of the story, especially in modern Western societies. Because if you recall, we said that one of the things IQ does, or we'll just call it intelligence, one of the things intelligence does is it allows people to learn cultural information more quickly and more of it, and better to navigate complicated culture, right? So you would expect that as culture becomes more complicated, there will be an increasing divide between intelligent people and less intelligent people, because the intelligent people will better be able to navigate it than the less intelligent people, and their interests might start to grow apart, right?
Yes. Yeah. And importantly, if we think about an important component of culture in modern societies is your occupation. That is what you do for a living to gain resources. And we know that since the 1950s, the occupations that give the most remuneration or pay you the most, and importantly, give you the most cultural status, are occupations that require complex cognition. That is, they are cognitively demanding, and individuals who have high IQs are going to better be able to perform and excel, right, in these occupations, including, like, say, being a lawyer,
An engineer, for
engineer,
example.
college professor,
Right.
even being a good high school teacher requires above average intelligence.
Right. And we
probably.
know from the literature very clear that there is indeed a relation between IQ scores and socioeconomic status.
Mhm.
There's a correlation between IQ and income, but the correlation between IQ and socioeconomic status is higher because some people trade status for income. So some
Right.
people become college professors at Harvard or something when maybe they could be a kind of elite worker on Wall Street or something and make more money. They like the status that
Right. So, for example, if you decide to be a social science professor at Northwestern University, you're not going to be remunerated as well as if you worked at D.E. Shaw, a hedge fund, right?
Right.
So you're sacrificing a lot of resources, a lot of monetary resources for in exchange for some cultural status and presumably doing something that you find intrinsically more enjoyable.
Right. And now, so we have this is already like ample reason for coalitional conflict because one group is getting on average more resources and more status than another group
More,
is.
yes.
And
So
this is like the sort of fundamental Marxian conflict, right? Just straightforward class conflict. One group has more resources than another. That creates bitterness, envy, etc.
But importantly, this is different from the Marxian analysis because the fundamental conflict here is not between owners of capital and
Right.
workers. It's between individuals who are able to successfully navigate complexity,
Right.
therefore get a college degree and get a professional managerial job, for
Right.
example,
Right.
and those who are not able to do that as effectively.
Right, but it's Marxian in that it's class based is what I'm
Yes.
saying. I guess it's in that it's like updated to the modern, like modern economy Marxism though, and that it's class based. But importantly, there's another part of this, which is as higher IQ people become more segregated from other people, right? This is a trend that we've seen in the past 70 years, let's say, which is high IQ people tend to cluster together. They live in the same environment, San Fran, whatever. They go to the same colleges, Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, Washington University, etc. They create more and more, they create a cultural a milieu that's different from the cultural milieu of people with lower IQs.
Right.
And as free time and luxury increases, the ability of people to create these cultures increases, right? So you have more time, free time to either to read, to watch television, to watch movies, etc. And high IQ people tend to be attracted to certain activities, reading, watching obscure films, foreign films, highbrow television, that people with lower IQ aren't as attracted to.
Mm-hmm.
And this creates this cultural divide, which, for example, Charles Murray calls, the coming apart.
And let's use to give a more concrete example of this cognitive divide and how it would play out. Let's just look at baseball and watching a baseball game and how that has played out differently between high IQ nerdy types and your average baseball fan.
Yeah, that's a good example. So we have this basic idea that these cultures are drifting apart, and just to think of it with the same activity, even here, baseball, the way that the cultures have grown apart. In 1970, everybody had access to the same statistics: home runs, RBIs, stolen bases. You watch the same broadcast and you listen to the same radio show talk about this, right?
So basically, the 150 IQ guy and the 105 IQ guy were watching the same game.
Right.
And obviously the 150 IQ individual was observing things that the less intelligent individual was not, but they were watching the same basic game.
Right.
With
And
the
they were
exception
also,
of like Bill James in the 70s, for
right,
example.
exactly. There were some like real innovators, but by and large, the average, like, you think the average dock worker of 100 IQ or something, and the average lawyer, who were both interested in the Boston Red Sox, they were immersed in the same culture. They listened to the same guy ranting about the Red Sox when they lost and praising them when they won, and they watched the same games, etc. Now,
and
after,
that's important, because then sports served as a way to unify, right? Or give this kind of cultural unity to individuals of very different cognitive talents.
Right. So you had this singular coalitionary identity, namely Red Sox fans, and you,
or even baseball fans.
And you were paying attention to the same basic world. Now there's something happens in the 70s and 80s called the analytics revolution, probably most famously written about in the book Moneyball by Michael Lewis. This is, I mean, it's complicated, but basically it's doing advanced statistical analysis to understand how players actually contribute to wins, right? Because wins, turns out, like, home runs are only valuable insofar as they help a team win. And there are these other things, on base percentage, all of these other statistics that might be informative about how a player contributes to wins that mainstream analysts were ignoring.
Right. And that Thorne and Palmer, who wrote a famous analytic baseball book, even before Moneyball, they called it the hidden game of baseball. And I think that's important, because if you're watching a baseball game on television, all of this is hidden from you. It's not immediately obvious, for example, that on base percentage is more important than batting average. Right. That's not manifest.
Right. So you think about these things where it's just like, if Wade Boggs rips a single when nobody's on base, that feels cooler than if he walks when nobody's on base. But in fact, it's the exact same outcome from a functional point of view, right? Namely, Wade Boggs is now on first base. And this is what analyticians or sabermeticians, whatever we want to call them.
Sabermetricians.
This is what they would say is like, look, it's equally valuable. There's no reason we should value the hit more, even though the average fan would look at Wade Boggs and say, oh, well, he batted 370. That's really cool.
Right. So now we get to the point where if you have individuals watching a baseball game in 2020, the high IQ wonk is thinking about things such as weighted runs created plus or fielding independent ERA, whereas the average IQ person is still watching it and just thinking about batting average, home runs.
Even more
RBI.
importantly, right, I think where you see the major conflict is the idea of like intangibles, will to win, these kind of concepts that you will hear announcers talk about, like Jack Morris just had a will to win. I don't give a shit what his ERA is. He just comes up big in the big game.
Right.
So
this here we're taking just one like domain, and you can see that what has happened over the last 50 years is that even the way that people appreciate and dabble in this domain is increasingly segregated by education and intelligence.
Right. And so on top of just to make this point further, on top of the fact that you have these different stats that you're looking at and different ways of understanding the game, you're not listening to the same programs anymore, because I find, for example, I'll just out myself as a fan of analytics and advanced analysis. I find like the morning talk show stuff, the Skip Bayless, Shannon Sharp yelling at each other, completely intolerable and uninformative. It's
Right.
inane in my view.
Right.
But that's probably what the average, I mean, judging from their ratings and the fact that they make more money in a year than I'll ever see in my life, they're doing just fine. And people like to tune in to listen to this. LeBron James just doesn't have what it takes to win in the fourth quarter
Right.
kind of argument.
So importantly, a lot of hyper educated, intelligent people have built up an infrastructure to put out products that appeal to people who are like you and I are, who like the analytics. So I'm listening to Effectively Wild, an analytic based podcast, and reading, say, fan graphs, whereas the average baseball viewer is still listening to the morning pundits go at it and reading, like, say, Sports Illustrated.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. I think this is it's important. It's a good example, you're right, because it's taking this same phenomenon and illustrating how the cultures are drifting apart, even when they're paying attention to the same thing. Now you think about, say, what kind of television do you want to watch? Well, you could watch The Wire, which is this rather slow, elaborate cop drama, or you could watch some immediately entertaining, I don't know what the popular show is now, like Two and a Half Men
Friends.
used to be, or Friends, or, you know, Friends is middle brow probably, but there are lots
Should
of
be
different.
lowbrow.
Pardon?
It really is lowbrow, but
I agree, it is probably lowbrow, but so you can choose your entertainment.
Right, and the point here is that not only is there now this increased demand for more cognitively demanding fare, there's also, because of technology and increasing affluence, there's a infrastructure that supplies it to people. So cable, we're not limited to 3 channels, right? You can choose to watch all kinds of entertainment.
Right. And so if you look at, for example, the number of people who watched I Love Lucy when it was like the king of or the queen of comedies, as it were, it was, I forget the exact number, but it was crazy how many people would tune into I Love Lucy. I don't know if it was probably, was it daily or weekly? I don't know. Let's say it was weekly, probably.
Or the last episode of MASH, where literally 70 million people tuned into it.
This is just crazy to think about. So let's say the world of I Love Lucy, if you went to a workplace, you could be pretty confident that many of the employees, including the management and like the people on the factory line, etc., had all watched I Love Lucy and could talk together whatever other differences they had about this television program. Now, the most watched show is getting like 1% of Americans tuning in. And there's just a huge divide between the entertainment decisions of highly intelligent people and less intelligent people, meaning they share less and less of a culture. When you go to work, you haven't watched the same program, and therefore you don't have this common culture to appeal to.
And as the example of baseball illustrates, even if you have watched the same program, the way that you interpreted it or observed it was very different, and the way that you think about it.
Right. Yes. So what we get then is this increasing divide between highly intelligent, highly educated, importantly, people, and less intelligent or less educated. Because I think the education's an important mediator, or it's an important component of this to consider. Getting education is, I mean, there are various traits that predict education. IQ is, of course, one of these traits. Educated people also tend to have different interests, highly educated people, different interests and preferences than people who aren't highly educated.
And so other traits that predict educational attainment would be conscientiousness, grit, which is basically
is just conscientiousness.
Yeah, it's basically, determination, ability to persevere through adversity, etc. But it's important just to note that education is independently predictive of this cultural chasm that's emerging independent of IQ, although
Right.
IQ is probably the most important variable there.
Yes. And then I think we get like one last individual difference trait that's probably important here, which is openness to experience.
Yep.
So openness to experience, it's basically measures like how much do you like novel things, novel ideas, novel physical adventures, traveling, different kinds of food, etc. And openness to experience is indeed correlated with IQ. It's about, as I recall, it's like somewhere around like 0.22-ish or something. Is that right?
Yeah, that's about right.
So
Yeah.
it's not a huge correlation, but it is a correlation. And openness to experience, you can, if you take two people and you make, for the extreme, you make one very high in openness to experience and the other one very low. And you think about what kind of movie would they watch tonight? The person who's very high in openness to experience might think, I'm going to watch that new weird Denis Villeneuve movie. And the person who's very low in experience might think, I'm going to watch that pretty traditional, entertaining action film, right?
I'm going to watch American Sniper.
Yes, I'm going to watch American Sniper, and that's cool. Like I'm familiar with it. I know the structure and how it's going to work. Whereas the person who's very open to experience might want something that's unique and challenging. Maybe it would seem boring, but to that person, it would seem provocative and interesting. So all of these things working together. So often we get high IQ, high openness, high education, all working together to lead to this cultural chasm that's growing probably, such that there's a coalition of people who share similar interests that tend to revolve around having high openness, high intelligence, and high education. And there's another group that tend to be lower in intelligence, but especially lower in openness to experience and lower in education.
Right. And so as we noted, there's also a geographical sort here, such that individuals who are high on openness, highly educated, and have high IQs tend to enjoy living in complex urban environments, right? Where the hustle and bustle of daily life, novel ethnic foods, a lot of cultural fare, museums, etc. And people who are low on, and also ethnic diversity just generally, and people who are lower on openness to experience and less educated tend to have more traditional values, prefer small towns and rural environments. They're less enamored of intellectual diversity and ethnic diversity, and I think importantly, cultural diversity.
Right. So
they're actually feel positive enmity often toward cultural diversity. It's viewed as a threat.
Right. It's upsetting in some sense. You could say it's just upsetting to their nervous system. So you can think about two people. If you have a person who's very open to experience and likes novel things, they might like New York City because every day could be completely different. You could go to a different kind of restaurant. You could experience a different cultural thing. You're going to bump into different people, different kinds of cultures, different sexual mores, etc. If you're somebody who doesn't like new things, you might find the Norman Rockwell painting USA much more appealing to your nervous system. Rural Iowa, where you can pretty much count on the same thing happening. You know the culture. It's pretty much the same everywhere. You go to the same barber shop, you get the same haircut. You go to the same restaurant, maybe you order the same meal. So there are all kinds of reasons people who are higher in openness would be more attracted to cities than others.
Right. And importantly, if you are low in openness to experience and you adhere to these more traditional values, you view anything that upsets that as threatening to your lifestyle, right? So if you're directly encountered, let's say that you're living in a small town in Iowa, and all of the sudden LGBTQ groups are putting on all of these parades. You might not have any animosity toward LGBTQ in particular, but you view that as a threat to the traditional values that you adhere to.
Right.
It's kind of foreign seeming, right? Like, wait, what's going on here? Why should I have to change my entire lifestyle to accommodate these people?
Right.
Why are they encroaching on me?
Importantly, I think it should be noted that it really is a threat in the sense that it is creating an alteration in the culture, and that to people with these kinds of traits and preferences, that is a challenge that they have to cope with.
Right.
So probably the best dual division here that I've seen in the literature is between what David Goodhart calls somewheres and anywheres. So anywheres are people who have traits that allow them to thrive largely in any metropolitan area. It doesn't matter which one it is. It could be New York, it could be London, it could be San Fran. They can be in any one of those and they'll be just fine. And also the skills that they have allow them to gain esteem pretty much anywhere. They're not dependent on the context that they're in. Whereas somewheres they have traits that make them prefer a locality in a specific one with specific norms and expectations and even buildings and restaurants, etc. And furthermore, their identity is wrapped up in their concrete social relationships.
So I'm sorry, go finish.
Well, just so that for them, like being the principal in a small town in Iowa is important to them, and they have concrete relationships in that small town in Iowa that are not transferable to San Francisco. If they moved to San Francisco, they would lose that and therefore lose a lot of their esteem and their identity and their meaning. So there are somewheres usually less educated, less open to experience, and then anywhere it's usually more educated, more open to experience, more cosmopolitan.
Right. And if you want an illustration of what somewhereism is, think of Bedford Falls as portrayed in It's a Wonderful Life, right? The importance of this local community where everybody knows everybody, not just the individual. I know his or her parents, I know his or her grandparents. The institutions are locally owned, right?
Right.
And there's a very strong sense of place here. Like you can't just transfer that out and have the same experience, right?
Right.
Which
and
is,
if you, so that's I think that's an important point, that the all of the institutions are known by the owner or the family that owns them. So it's not just like when Walmart's the same no matter where you go, right? It's Walmart. You don't think of it as Bill's Walmart or Tammy's Walmart. Whereas in this kind of small town, it's, oh, that's Bill's grocery store or Tommy's barber shop. And those are singular and unique to that area and not transferable.
right. And obviously Frank Capra really loved somewhereism. Right?
Yes. And many people love somewhereism, like Norman Rockwell's America, small town America, and many people love cosmopolitanism. Now, the important thing is we have these evolutionary propensities to create coalitions, to battle for resources, and to forward narratives that allow us to justify the resources that we want.
And to gain cultural status, importantly.
Yes, and cultural status is an important resource, right? Identity status. So we have this coalition now that's becoming a coalition of educated, open people, and a coalition of relatively less educated, less open people. And these are the coalitions that are clearly beginning to, well, they're more than incipient in the United States. Importantly, the major institutions of information in the United States, the media and the university system,
I'd say Hollywood would be
and Hollywood is a good example.
Important cultural
Yes.
institution.
These institutions now are largely dominated by anywheres, right? So the media are definitely dominated by anywheres. Academia is overwhelmingly dominated by these people. And what happens is,
and also importantly, even the quote unquote corporate titans of our day are anywheres.
yes,
Right.
yes,
As opposed to if you think about the corporate institutions of the 1950s, they were synonymous with America, with the United States, right? And
Right.
even within the United States, a particular place, like it was the big three, right, is Michigan, Detroit.
right.
Now these individuals, like for example, Jeff Bezos and Amazon, you don't think of Amazon as particularly located in one place, right?
Same thing with Facebook, right?
Yeah,
And in fact,
Facebook,
these
Twitter.
places, to them, foreign business is business that they want. I mean, they have there's no peculiar attachment to any location. There's an attachment to customers wherever, from wherever they come. And also, like, think of the difference between the idea of like the businessman in 1945 or 50 and now. So the small business owner, for example, is a somewhere by necessity because they're in a certain context and their customers are all from that area, unless they're tourists. But let's just say they're generally from that area, so they know the people and they have the values of localism because if the local community changes, that really affects them. Whereas if your Facebook and some local community in Iowa changes, it doesn't matter to you in the slightest.
Right.
Right. So the media and universities now are overwhelmingly full of anywheres. And so what happens is we have these evolutionary tendencies to create coalitions, to see our own coalition as somehow righteous, the other coalition against whom we are competing as, if not evil, at least unaware of our righteousness. And therefore, we need to either persuade them of our righteousness or somehow vanquish them.
Yeah.
And that leads to a lot of biases and then moral narratives, which are often little more than justifications for one group's status over another group.
Right.
And we're seeing more and more of this conflict play out, and more of the major institutions being captured by the anywhere moral narrative. Yeah.
And so what would you say is the kind of fundamental message of the anywhere moral narrative?
Right. So that's a good question. An important point here is like the anywhere moral narrative is the moral narrative that argues that diversity is the greatest thing. It's our greatest strength. Everywhere, always, diversity is really good, and education is really good. And there's something like off-putting about localism because it's kind of parochial. It's seen as being, like that's what Philistines would do.
Yeah.
There's a value in novel films, independent films, and kind of a mockery and condescension toward popular rom-coms or popular entertainment, even maybe of the NFL and of the person who just comes home and cracks a Miller Lite and watches Monday Night Football.
Right. And kind of a utilitarian ethical system where somebody who is in anywhere, if you gave to a local charity instead of performing effective altruism where you actually looked up how can I get the most bang for my buck regardless of where the individuals I'm helping reside, whether that's in Africa or Thailand or Canada, doesn't matter, right? Whereas somewhere would tend to just prefer individual, like, look, I know that this, Bob's business here does charitable work in the community, that's where I'm going to give my money, even if that's inefficient.
Right. I can't, and in fact, that leads to this big difference, which is like, how much more do you care about your own community than other communities? Right. And this is important because anywheres act as though a preference for local community or local people over other people is, and somehow it's a moral failure, right? It's not just a preference, a personality preference.
Right, but and somewheres have the opposite bias where they view, well, why would you why would you spend money on anti-malarial nets in Africa, right? When you could put that money back in the local community and beautify the park.
Yes, exactly. So anything that sort of like there's no reason to think either coalition's narrative is intrinsically better than the others. I mean, you could have a complicated debate about what the effects of the various moral narratives are, but they both have their narratives. And notice the thing here is that they're not abstract moral consideration. I mean, some of them maybe, but largely they're narratives that justify and defend the coalition's desires about the distribution of resources and status in the world.
Right. So specifically, my narrative that I adhere to, if I'm a somewhere, is actually beneficial to the coalition of somewheres, namely my community or my local community. And that, like, in terms of economic policy, let's say, preference for protectionism, for example, if it helps the factory in my community stay in business, I'm going to make an argument in favor of protectionism. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it concretely helps my community. Even if an economist tells me, actually, comparative advantage, Ricardo nailed this 200 years ago, right? Let your factory go under, people will adjust to it.
Right. It's better for everyone.
Consumers benefit.
Bigger. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this is like just a understandable, and a lot of things are like this. For example, attitudes toward immigration, things that we don't think are like personality or coalitionary quirks or things that we're battling about because of our coalitions, really are. And it's sometimes better to think about these things from this perspective than this moral perspective of which one's more moral, because a lot of these things are just the result of personality quirks. So immigration.
So, take immigration, and then we'll note the recent polarization around education, or actually attitudes toward higher education specifically.
Yeah. So immigration, which is largely lauded by the media, promoted by the media and academia, and immigration restrictionism, or the idea that we should reduce the amount of immigrants who come into the country, and we should prefer immigrants who have more affinity for our culture. Those attitudes are considered almost like just uncouth at best and xenophobic and racist at worst.
Yeah.
But it's important to note that these attitudes make sense just from the coalition's perspective. If you're a somewhere and having immigrants come into your community would change the community in ways that are actually detrimental to your psychological preferences, it makes sense that you would oppose immigration or you would desire immigration restriction. Conversely, if you're in anywhere, and in fact, maybe you benefit from, or at least you're not harmed by this kind of diversity, and perhaps you can use it to signal your generosity or your intellectual sophistication, it makes sense that you would promote it. And the thing that's happening that I think we'll talk about after the education thing, but just to preview that, is that this one coalition has basically commandeered all of the informational channels, and it's creating a lot of alienation from the somewhere coalition feels bitter and alienated from them, and that alienation and bitterness, both of those are growing.
Yes. And so if we look at, let's say, attitudes toward higher education, up until about a decade ago, there was just universal positive, there was universally positive views toward higher education, toward college, etc., regardless of where you polled people. And what you've seen, especially since the rise of Donald Trump, is that now there's a real chasm opening up between Democrats and Republicans on view of higher education, such that Republicans really view it as kind of a waste, right? It's and actually like a net negative.
Well, we should specify here that Republicans more and more are the coalition of somewheres,
yes,
and Democrats more and more are the anywheres. Yeah.
And so this, again, this makes sense if you just think of it from this coalitional perspective, because somewheres, first of all, possessing a advanced degree is less important for them in their daily lives and in their communities. And then secondly, I think they correctly, or at least many of them correctly, understand that higher education is one of the main institutions that creates anywheres and fuels these institutions that promote anywhereism.
At least if it doesn't create, because Jeffrey Sachs would argue that that's sort of the propaganda.
Yeah, fair enough. But they see,
promote. Certainly, the university promotes anywhereism.
Yeah, they see the pattern that people who go to these universities also promote anywhereism. Whether or not that relationship is causal is a separate debate.
Yes. So what we think is using this framework, you can start to understand the populist backlash in the past 20 years in the West as a reaction largely of somewheres against the overwhelming dominance of anywhereism in the media and in the university system. So
because would it be fair to say that the kind of essence of populism is a hatred, or at least a skepticism of the elite?
Yes, I would say if you look at the sort of technical literature on populism, I think the best way of looking at it is it's a political narrative that divides the world into elites and the people, and views the people favorably and the elites unfavorably.
Right. So you could kind of translate that into views anywheres, the elite anywheres unfavorably, and the somewheres, the good, hardworking, salt of the earth, as virtuous.
Yes, and if you look at the rhetoric that populists use, it's rife with insults and denunciations of educated elites or cosmopolitans. And it praises real Americans, hardworking Americans, middle-class Americans, basically people who fit into the somewhere coalition. And the language essentially argues that they're morally superior and deserve more resources and more cultural status.
Right. Whereas the woke anywhere narrative would have the exact opposite moral argument, namely that educated anti-racist elites are morally superior to the xenophobic rubes.
Right. And therefore they deserve more cultural status and more resources. And I think the cultural status, just for the way that humans evolved, one thing that we evolved, one sort of mechanism, module, whatever, is a kind of social comparison mechanism or module. That is, we compare ourselves to other people. How are other people doing? How am I doing? Is this fair? Do I have more than they do? Do they have more than I do? If they have more than I do, I get angry or envious or bitter. But also group comparisons. How's my group doing relative to their group? Is this person insulting my group? If so, I get angry and bitter about it. And you can see that somewheres feel as though they're constantly being insulted, assailed, mocked by the anywhere elite media. So
Yes.
a term that they use often is prestige media or elite media.
Yeah.
They feel as though it's mocking them and their traditions. Anytime
Yes.
they read an article that says, you know, fuck the founders, or the founders were racist slave owners, that feels like an insult to them, because they're people who generally take pride in the country, and they're the heroes of the country. The founding fathers, who are great ancestors, are great heroes. And so that's just like one way of mocking their coalition.
And I think importantly, the somewheres are not wrong in that anywhereism is spreading quite rapidly.
Right.
And I think a particularly salient area where this has spread in the last 5 or 10 years is in sports, right? So you can see this with the reaction to Colin Kaepernick in the NFL taking the knee, right? So this, a lot of people look at that and say like, oh, like big deal, right? Like why would you care that much about it? But to a somewhere, it's just another example of this kind of woke anywhereism narrative encroaching upon what was once a neutral cultural domain. And now the elite are spreading their nefarious ideas.
Right. Their nefarious, their pernicious ideology is poisoning almost everything. Now,
Yes.
I think it's worth thinking about why does the Kaepernick knee and the reaction to it feel as though it's spit in the face of the somewheres? Because you think about what's happening here. For first, you have explicit diversity. Now, I think it's important to know, I don't think somewheres generally are actually off-put by racial diversity per se.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if they were in a community, I mean, they might have some attachment to demographics, that's whatever, but
or certainly culture.
Yes, but it's important that as culture, like if they're in a community that has a kind of culture, and a Black person or an Asian person comes into that community and adheres to that culture, I think they're okay with that. That's not disconcerting to them. Mm-hmm. What is disconcerting is this explicit in your face diversity,
right?
That people like Colin Kaepernick draw attention to, whereas a lot of football players, of course, are African Americans, and a lot of somewheres love football, but they're not drawing attention to the diversity. Kaepernick is drawing attention to the fact that he's a Black person who's been treated unfairly. So he's accusing the coalition that the somewheres like, this American coalition, the police, of treating Black people unfairly, persistently. And on top of that, he's refusing to embrace, recognize the anthem of the somewheres, the country, which is basically like spitting on the flag to them. It just feels like this guy's making millions of dollars in our country, and then refusing to recognize its greatness and actually railing against it. So it just feels as though it's this attack on their culture. And then what they see is that he's lauded by many people in the media. And on top of that, he's eventually lauded by corporations.
Yes, he gets
Nike, for example.
A series of ads with Nike,
right?
Which even throws it in your face even more. So while you're struggling, the factory in your community shuttered 10 years ago. People are really having a rough go of it. Colin Kaepernick is shitting all over your sacred values and becoming rich from it.
Right. Becoming rich and famous.
Yes.
For making all of these.
Whereas you're viewed as some kind of backwards racist clown for even trying to criticize him.
Right. So I think that's an important thing, is that not only are somewheres sort of condescended to and told that they need to accept these cultural changes, they are accused of being the worst kind of people, namely racist bigots, if they're not on board with it. If they think, you know what, I'm, you know, this racial diversity makes me uncomfortable, or especially this in your face diversity or this cultural diversity, that's considered one of the most egregious sins to the anywheres. And they're happy to spread this idea that these people are racist and that the Trump coalition is racist, etc.
So I think an important concept to help understand some of these culture war issues that occur between somewheres and anywheres is the idea of that David French coined, condensed symbols.
No,
Right.
that was Rod Dreher.
Oh, Rod Dreher coined it,
Yeah.
and David French has often used it because I think it
Yes.
does help make sense of this. So a condensed symbol is something where, for example, take the issue of masking during COVID. So seemingly uninteresting, right? Like, who cares about masking?
Right.
But it becomes a condensed symbol when it coalesces with these kind of sacred values and these competing narratives. So it's viewed
Right.
as, it's not just about masking, it's about my entire way of life.
Yes.
Freedom, right? Right. Or if you're in,
Or listening to experts.
right. Or or not killing grandma and listening to the experts.
Right. And importantly, what we saw among a lot of Democrats, who probably many of them felt as though they were just trying to do the right thing, but it ends up being this kind of tribal signaling that alienates somewheres, is the whole trust the science, we believe in science, we're for science, which of course they're not for science, because we can go through all kinds of science denialism on the left. What that really is not a we dispassionately trust data and just go with the data. It's this whole like infrastructure of experts and educated elites. We value them, and we're going to promote the idea that they deserve our deference. And yes, I like this idea of condensed symbols, because each of these items in isolation, they're silly, right? And people say, well, why are you making a big deal out of this? Or why do you give a shit if one person kneels during the anthem? But each one becomes like the whole, the totality of the coalitionary conflict is contained in the symbol.
Right.
So Dr. Fauci, for example, almost becomes a condensed symbol, because to the sort of Republican populist crowd, he's seen as this expert who opines when he doesn't actually know what he's talking about, and basically just promotes the progressive agenda while declaring he's a dispassionate scientist. And to the Anywhere coalition, he's this great expert who's promoting this dispassionate message of what we should do, and information and expertise are to be not just to be trusted, but also we should defer to them and give them status.
Right. And so if we think about the increasing cultural chasm and lifestyle chasm that's opening up, and the fact that these differences in lifestyle are also increasingly manifest in the two major political coalitions, that helps understand negative polarization, right? Because
right. So just before getting to that, I think there's one other thing we should think about or bring into this, which is the way that these coalitions have become, all of our like competing coalitions have started to kind of overlap into one coalition in a way that I forget the thinker, but I think she calls it mega identities.
Yeah.
Right? Which the way to think about mega identity is really it's all of your coalitionary interests are starting to overlap, which you might think is good because it's like, hey, like you share more interests with the people in your coalition. It's good for in that sense, but it's bad in the sense that when you sort of create two pure coalitions. So what do I mean by that? I mean, like,
what does that mean?
It used to be that maybe your economic coalition, your cultural interest coalition, and your religious coalition were all three separate.
Mhm.
So if a Republican won or a Democrat won, it's like, okay, fine, like I'm going to pay more attention to religion now or whatever. You know, the way that if your team loses a game, you're like, fuck it, I don't care about that. I'm going to go read like F. Scott Fitzgerald and feel good about that. So you could sort of relieve the pain of a coalitionary loss in the political domain by paying attention to a different domain.
Right. So the idea that uh, each of the identities that a person has, it used to be the case that one particular identity wouldn't give you that much information about their other identities.
Right.
Right. So maybe this CEO who's filthy rich also just really enjoys country music and McDonald's. Right.
Right.
Right. You couldn't predict.
Hyper religious. They're
Right.
a strong evangelical. So if you think about it, if the non-evangelical candidate wins, then maybe you share other things with that candidate. Now what's happened is all of these have merged together such that if your candidate, just an example of your candidate losing, if your candidate represents all or many of your identities, your religious identity, your cultural identity, the kind of entertainment you like, the kind of restaurants you would go to. And in fact, politicians clearly recognize this and attempt to signal their belonging to a coalition. So for example, Pete Buttigieg, the who is an anywhere candidate par excellence, right, made a big deal, and maybe it's just true, but also he made a big deal about James Joyce's Ulysses being his favorite novel. And you might think, who the fuck cares what novel Pete Buttigieg reads?
Right.
Well, this is a signal that I'm a hyper educated person. I belong to the coalition of the hyper educated, right? That's what that's signaling.
Right.
Trump eats fast food endlessly and broadcasts it. What's that signaling? It's signaling I'm not some cultural elitist. I'm the person just like you who's going to go to McDonald's to get my food.
Right. So another way of thinking about this is just think about how many probably correct inferences you can make about a person if I simply tell you that they're a vegan and they shop at Whole Foods. Right.
They're definitely a Democrat, right?
Right.
That's the first thing.
They're liberal, right? They're probably woke, right? They're probably not very religious. They're probably favorable toward ethnic and cultural diversity, and so on. You can go right down the list.
Religious things important. It's just you think about like the difference between the Republicans and Democrats. Now, the Democrats are clearly the party of the non-affiliated religious group. I think they're majority non.
Yes.
Whereas Republicans are clearly now the party of Christians. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't Christians in the Democratic coalition. There are.
No, but ask yourself how many devout Christians are there who identify as liberal Democrats, right?
Yeah, and I don't know the exact number, but it's certainly
not a large percentage of conservative or of fundamentalists. Or
if one were a good Bayesian and I told you, here's Bob, he's a devout evangelical, which party does he vote for? You would say Republican, definitely, without hesitation.
Right. And if you said, what's the probability that Bob is vegan? I would, whatever the base rate level of veganism in the United States is, I would go far below that to estimate that probability.
Right. And this is so powerful that you can even do this. So the New York Times had the people's refrigerators. and I think, I mean, I did it many times. I don't know what the overall is. So there's a danger in saying the aggregate here, but I know I took this test multiple times and it was better than random. I could vote, I could pick, were they a Trump voter or a Biden voter? Now, I don't want to say it wasn't like 80%. It was more like 55, 60%. Right. But that's just looking at the contents of a person's refrigerator.
Right. Or the vehicle that they drive, that you can do that above chance is pretty impressive. And that's what the mega identity is all about the stacking up of all of these individual identities. And importantly, sorting those mega identities into coalitions.
Right. So I think, so from the big picture, the way to think about this is you have this incredibly large country, the United States, and you share certain interests as a country competing against other countries. But within that country, you have lots of different groups that form to compete for resources and for status, etc. It used to be the case that those coalitions that you form to compete were more sort of myriad, and sometimes they begin to overlap in a way where you create like 2 or 3 really salient coalitions. So a good example of this is the events leading up to the Civil War. It became more and more the case that Northern interest and Southern interest aligned in such a way, or the North aligned with the North, the South with the South, in such a way that those 2 identities and coalitions became the 2 salient coalitions in the country. Whereas actually before, people don't really realize this or think about it, but there were all kinds of interests. Like Western interests were different from Eastern, and people would think about, oh, those are the Western people, the Eastern people. It wasn't like we're the North, they're the South all the time, or those weren't the only salient coalitions. But
or you could look even immediately post civil rights, when you had liberal Republicans mostly concentrated in the Northeast, like the Rockefeller Republicans, right?
Right.
And then you had more conservative Republicans, and you had the same phenomenon with the Democratic Party, where you had liberal Democrats, again, mostly in the North and the Northeast, and you had conservative Democrats mostly in the South, right? So you have these cross pressures on individual identity.
In other words, just as the coalitions were much more complicated pre, let's say, 1848 than North-South, but then they became more and more purified into North-South, so too Republican-Democrat coalitions used to be much more complicated, and then they slowly became more purified after the civil rights bills of 64.
And importantly, the major axis where they've been purified is geography, specifically urban versus rural.
Right. So all of this, like somewhere, anywhere, is really manifest, of course, in geography, because anywheres tend to enjoy cities, bigger cities, and they tend, if they don't already live there, they move there.
Yes.
And somewheres tend to be more attracted to rural areas, smaller towns, smaller, I don't know if smaller cities, but smaller areas that are more stable, less dynamic.
Yeah. And so if you want to see how extreme that sort is, the New York Times published an extremely detailed map of the 2016 election. So obviously you see first that counties that are rural are almost exclusively red, but more impressively, even when you look at cities, the closer you get to the center of the city, the bluer the precincts are. Right. So this is quite a granular sort that has occurred over the last 50 to 60 years.
Right. And the Democratic Party is just clearly and dominantly the party of the anywhere, the city dweller. And then the Republican is clearly and dominantly the coalition of the rural dweller. And it's such that what you see when you look at a voting map in the United States is that most of the United States is red, i.e. Republican.
Right.
A very small amount of it is blue, i.e. Democrat, but the blue tends to be in these incredibly population dense areas, cities. And so Democrats and Republicans are roughly equally competitive because the Democrats own the high density areas.
That's right. That's right. And then, so if you look at the avant-garde of the anywheres in the Democratic Party, it would be the Squad. And that's why I think that they do deserve the attention that they get, even though they're not individually.
What is the Squad?
So it's a set of young representatives, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ileana Presley, and there's one other
There's
that
Omar.
Yeah, Ilhan Omar.
Yeah.
So it's a group of extremely racially and economically progressive Democrats who I think they were all elected in
2016.
2016.
Yeah.
Yeah. And their ideas that is the future of the Democratic coalition in the anywheres. They're just extreme anywheres, racially diverse,
Ideologically
economically
very progressive,
very woke,
diverse, very pro-immigrant,
very urban.
Right. And then like questionable patriotism in the sense that they probably find it kind of uncouth to be like America fucking rules.
Right. And if you looked at, conversely, the kind of avant-garde of the emerging somewhere coalition, I think you would look at obviously Donald Trump Jr., Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton. The real populist rhetoric, even veering into the QAnon stuff with Marjorie Taylor Greene, right?
I think the QAnon shit is sort of just a peripheral, extraneous kind of signal that's not, I mean, because it doesn't really have any connection necessarily to the status or material interests.
Well, it has to the extent that it makes the elite seem even more corrupt.
That's true. Yeah,
not only are the elite fucking you economically, they're actually all pedophiles, right?
They are promoting pedophilia, and then you can see how you get like a crazy conspiracy like that, but it's given like brushstrokes, bringing it into reality, this abstract picture, when you get things like Cuties, this movie that was it was a French film. It was released by Netflix that, well, we shall say it depicted young children in sexually provocative ways that was at least ethically dubious, and one could imagine and see why people were offended by it. Yes. And then this is sort of like, well, you don't have to go full QAnon, right? You say, well, QAnon's just hinting at this real reality, which is that in Hollywood, these children are sexually exploited by these anywhere elites.
Right. Yeah. Right. I think that's correct. So whether or not the GOP goes full QAnon remains to be seen, but you can see that these populist anti-elite narratives, anti-educated elite, anti-Hollywood, anti-mainstream media are going to become more salient and more prevalent within the Republican Party.
Yes.
And so this is what we're talking about with the negative polarization, because you're getting increasingly disparate narratives, lifestyles, right? Mm-hmm. And geographies. And as all of that kind of sorts together, it's not surprising that you get increased enmity between these coalitions.
Right. And it's importantly, from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense that fear would be a stronger motivator than a lot of other things, because if you lose to another coalition, you lose status, you lose resources, and in many times in history, you lost your life.
Right.
So a foreign, quote unquote, foreign and hostile coalition is something you should be very attuned to. And that it's like a kind of atmospheric pressure that pushes your coalition together, because you know what? Who gives a shit if you like Johnny? If he can help you survive from this alien coalition, he's on your side, damn it. And so an important thing to think about with this growing conflict inside the United States is also that one of the things that held the more national coalition together was having a hostile external enemy.
Yes.
namely the Soviet Union or communism, that you could point to and say, we're not communist and we're afraid of communist takeovers. And that held people in the United States together. You lost the external enemy with the fall of the Soviet Union. And you haven't had a serious existential threat. I mean, people have attempted to create one, the axis of evil, for example, but I think people correctly intuited that there was no real existential threat to the United States posed by any of the countries that were in the so-called axis of evil. And what this means is that with less atmospheric pressure holding the coalition together, it starts to break apart from the inside as individual or within group competition increases in importance, and between group from the outside decreases.
Right. So then you get increases in the feelings of, as you said, fear toward the out group.
Right,
But
which
you
is
also,
now an in group, by the way. It's the out group is now somebody inside. It's a coalition inside the United States.
right, but you see these increases in righteous indignation, in anger, and then in the collection and harvesting of grievances against the out group
Right.
coalition.
Right. So this fear and hatred, and I think the troubling thing about this is that it's quite rational, right? Because the fact of the matter is the coalitions are growing apart in many ways. And so it's not irrational for somebody in rural Iowa to think these elites hate me and they are a threat to my lifestyle. They're trying to promote all of these things, polyamory even, and just different sexual mores and things for my daughter that I don't want, and things, racial diversity and changing my culture. And
Right.
I have to learn Spanish because I can't understand the fucking phone. You know, like when I call this thing, it speaks Spanish first and I don't know what it's saying.
Right.
It really is a threat to them.
And I think it's important to understand that there's an asymmetry in the threat here, because the anywheres are clearly more powerful economically and culturally. They've been emboldened, maybe not more powerfully economically, but certainly culturally, and they're in the ascendant economically.
Right. Well, yes. And I think importantly, they are dominant culturally. I think
Yes,
this is really important because
cultural domain, there's no contest. Like, you can talk about Fox News, but Fox News cannot compete against Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, ABC, MSNBC all put together,
right,
and
so
NPR, etc.
People often engage in the sophistic argument that, oh, well, look at Fox is the most watched news program. Yeah, but not if you add CNN, MSNBC, ABC, all of these other stations together, then it's not even close. And also, yeah, WAPO, Boston Globe, LA Times, New York Times, all of these papers, Hollywood, they're
Right.
all clearly part of the coalition of the Anywhere Democratic Progressive Coalition.
Right. And higher education, I think, plays an important role there, because as we noted, like, almost any occupation that is well remunerated in 2020 requires at least a bachelor's degree. And you have these academic institutions are quite homogenous in their promotion of anywhereism.
Yes.
Sans a few exceptions such as Hillsdale or Liberty University.
Right.
But
I mean, so much so, right, that they have mandatory diversity statements, which are essentially tell us how progressive you are, how anywhere you are, because the fact of the matter is a somewhere person doesn't necessarily like diversity. And it's interesting how that's come to mean that you're a bad human. Like, if you wrote in your diversity statement, look, like, I like my white rural Iowa town, it has some Asians and some Hispanics and some blacks, but we're all like, we share this culture and we're largely white, and I'm used to that and I like that, and I don't like cultural diversity. I want to watch the same, people on TV who look like I do, and that's what I care about. That's perceived as being absolutely malevolent, right?
Right. And so if you want to see like this coalitional conflict, like if you're trying to think about, well, what does that concretely look like? Look at the reaction among anywheres to the election of Donald J. Trump in 2016 and how over the top it was and how much they melted down, right? The main anywhere institutions, the mainstream prestige media,
Yes.
Hollywood, academia, etc.
Right.
That gives you some indication, because you can kind of mock that, like, what? That's ridiculous. There's no need to go over the top. But if you were in anywhere, you really viewed that as almost this existential threat.
Right.
And so you were going to do whatever you could to become a part of the resistance and prevent Trump from being successful, including impeaching him.
Importantly, Trump is this new, like the sort of the manifestation of the somewhereism of the Republican Party and the wresting it away from relatively elite, more anywhere types, right? Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, McCain, and Mitt Romney, right? Yeah. Mitt Romney is this very educated, urbane person who shied away. Yes, who shied away from populism and talking. I mean, he said a few things, obviously, about immigration, but really shying away from a lot of these issues that the base cared about, whereas Trump did not. Trump said, the first thing he did was bash the United States for its stupidity about immigration. At one point, he called for a ban on all travel from Islamic countries because, and again, if you're a Christian evangelical in a Christian community, that's much more of a threat to you to have spreading Islam, whether it should or not, leave that aside, than it is to somebody who's a cosmopolitan atheist. And so Trump appealed to those people, and the elite viewed this with absolute horror, right?
Right. This specifically the cultural elite.
The cultural elite, right. I mean, this is why their reaction to Donald Trump was so hysterical and histrionic, because this is like all of these values which they viewed as not just alien, but rather threatening to their very sort of identity and the United States that they were trying to create, the cultural environment they were trying to create.
Right, which would lead to insane hyperbole, such as these alt-right racists are going to take over the United States, or they're ascendant and we have to beat them back, otherwise they're going to take power, which couldn't be further from the truth, right?
Right. This is what happens, I think, when you and this is why, by the way, that I think you get this there's an asymmetry, maybe even in the fear and the sort of like cultural grievance, because there's really a massive asymmetry in the cultural power.
Right. Yeah.
So it's not, if you're anywhere, if you're a progressive anywhere, your culture is everywhere. Right? I mean, you read the New York Times, you watch a Hollywood movie, everything's diversity is awesome, celebrate these cultures, we need more diversity, feminism, sexual liberation, etc. If you're somewhere, you actually have to work to find your culture sort of in these alternative channels, right? You have to listen to talk radio, find the right specific podcast, watch the right specific films, the few that are made for appealing to your group, etc.
Right. So the somewheres have fewer options in the cultural milieu, which is why they tend to universally listen to Rush Limbaugh and watch Tucker Carlson.
Universally is a bit.
Well, yeah,
they tend to be popular. They why Passion of the Christ was such a hit, or American Sniper, and the elites were sort of perplexed by this and maybe even offended by it, right?
But there is research, right, that people who tend to be liberal consume more media outlets than people who are conservative. But I think it's explainable because the actual somewhere conservative media outlets are relatively rare.
Right. Yeah, that is.
So if I'm in anywhere, I can do BBC, NPR, and ABC and feel just fine.
Wait, imagine that you sort of want to watch a film that is celebrating not diversity, but rather cultural continuity, and maybe even looking at what happens when a culture gets too diverse and breaks apart. This is not easy to find that, right? It's just that's a difficult thing, or that celebrates, I don't know, like chastity and discipline or whatever. I mean, it's not easy to find those things. So yeah, I think that's right, and that because the anywhereism, the kind of progressive, what we might call wokeism now, right? Like what wokeism is, this imperial narrative that is it's not content to say, well, there are these people there and they have a different culture and they don't want diversity, and that's fine. Right. That's okay. They get to do that. They can do that. That's not how wokeism views it, as a moral imperative that you have to. It's like a religion in the sense, a religion that promotes conversion. Mm-hmm. You have to go into the community and convert the people to the righteous side. Otherwise, you're letting them be sinners who will be damned in some sense, right?
And that kind of makes sense just from somewhere versus anywhere, right? If you're anywhere, everywhere has to be the same for you. Everywhere has to be woke and diverse, etc. For somewheres, there's more heterogeneity that's acceptable because you're content in your local environment.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I wonder if there is something to that.
I'm not sure. Like one could do research on that at least, but it superficially, at least, it makes sense that that would be the case.
And so I think the thing that, like, this kind of like thinking about intelligence and then evolutionary theory about this conflict and competition and personality quirks, an important thing that this adds to thinking about these problems is don't mistake the narrative for an objective moral account of the world, and learn to recognize the way that underlying personality quirks and material cultural interests are driving things.
Yes.
Right? Because what happens is, I mean, both sides do this, of course. There's this tendency to think this is an objective moral account of the world. And if you are against immigration, you're not just expressing a preference, but rather you are expressing a morally abominable opinion about the world that should be excommunicated from polite political conversation, right?
Right. And so let's just wrap up by maybe briefly touching on how we think this will play out maybe in the next decade or so.
So we're going to make prognostications.
We're going to prognosticate.
So that we can look fucking stupid when we listen to it in 10 years.
Right. Well, one thing I feel pretty comfortable saying is that this cognitive and lifestyle sorting is going to continue. There's no feasible end to it, which would suggest that the political coalitions are also going to become are going to drift further apart from each other.
Yes, right. It's hard to imagine these tendencies abating anytime soon, because
right, because you look at it from 2016 to the 2020 election, one thing that was consistent is the increase in the diploma divide between
Yes.
people who voted Republican and people who voted Democrat.
Right,
Right.
right, yes.
So that trend will probably continue. I don't see that
Yes.
ending anytime soon.
I feel comfortable saying that as well. And I think what we can see from this next generation of academics and journalists is absolutely horrifying to me.
Also, some of the far right-wing stuff is absolutely horrifying as well.
I applaud that. No, I don't know. I will, to put my cards on the table, I'm a bit more sympathetic with somewheres to some degree, although I'm obviously an educated elite, so I have those traits as well. But
let's say the over the next decade, the somewheres don't concern me as much because they don't have as much cultural
yes,
or
right.
economic power.
And what we're seeing now is that the sort of somewhere capture of institutions such as academia and the media is becoming more and more complete, such that
You
there's
mean
less
the anywhere capture?
Yeah, I'm sorry, anywhere capture. Yeah, such that there's less resistance. And what that means is that now, if you violate the sacred norms or values of the anywheres in the New York Times or in a university, you're punished and expelled from it. They don't even tolerate that anymore. And what we've seen is even a lot of progressive or some progressive journalists have left elite or well remunerated positions at elite institutions and gone on their own because they're having a tough time talking openly about certain issues without facing blowback from people within their own institution. So we would expect this trend to continue, and in fact it's kind of like, I think of like the New York Times is like a soup on a burner where you're sort of boiling out the impurities more and more, and it's becoming more and more an outlet for anywheres.
Yes. And then I guess the outstanding question is, do one or more states secede from the union
Right.
within the next 2 decades?
Yes, because people have, I think, understandably talked a lot about a potentially a potential civil war arising in the United States, because what they see is two coalitions becoming more and more divorced and alien to each other and more hostile to each other, in the same way that we saw this from the 1850s to 61 when the first Civil War. And it's different from the first Civil War in that it's not geographically contiguous, right? So
Yes.
that's the thing, is that you have these cities in areas. So like Atlanta is much different from surrounding Georgia.
Mhm.
And rural New York is different from New York City. So you don't have like this contiguous territory, a north and a south, as you had in the 1850s and 60s, but you have some like Texas and California. So in David French's book Divided We Fall, in which he wrote these compelling fictional stories of Cal exit and Texit, right, where these
Yes.
states leave the union, you have enough shared overlap of interest in California and maybe in Texas or some other place like Alabama or North Dakota, that you could see them becoming so alienated by the broader country that they decide they want to leave it.
Yes. And so importantly, we're not seriously contemplating the idea of a civil war where you're rolling armies into the
Right.
battlefield.
Right.
It's just we no longer want to be a part of this project called the United States.
Well, you can see from just the reaction to the 2020 election what we're looking at, right? The amount of animosity and horror with
The inability for Democrats to be honest that they actually stole the election is appalling.
Right, that this democratic machine engineered this steal from the somewheres. No, but I mean, I think one thing is you have obviously Trump's singular personality promoting this, but another thing is people are just more there's more on the line each election for individuals, and so much so that they're incapable of accepting the election
Right.
because it seems like such a blow to their ego and to their coalition.
Right. And to be clear, Trump is an atrocity, and his unique characterological flaws do account for a significant portion of what's happening after this election. However,
Yeah,
if you contemplate what would have happened if Trump won, it also would instill fear in you. I have no doubt that there would have been widespread violent protest almost immediately.
Yeah, yes, but and also I think this is important. So I agree that Trump's character is disqualifying for presidency, and that he is personally such a train wreck that he shouldn't be trusted to head any kind of coalition. However, I don't think that that's the major concern with the elite media and academics. I actually think if Trump were more urbane and sophisticated and more capable of promoting his group interests, he would be even more hated, because he would actually successfully enact nationalistic policies, scale back immigration, etc., much better than he can, because he's just uninterested, easily distracted. He's not lazy, but he's just not committed to the long game.
Yeah, well, he's uninterested in day-to-day governance.
Right,
That's quite clear.
Exactly. He's most comfortable in the rough and tumble cultural battles, just like easy things that he can pick on. And
calling Rosie O'Donnell a pig, and
right, or trolling libs on this or that thing, or giving a press conference and saying that there were some decent people in this group that you're belittling, whatever. So the reason I would reject Trump is because of his personological failures. I think most elite reject him because of his ideological, whatever his personal beliefs are, basically irrelevant. The ideology for which he stands is loathsome to him, to the anywhere elites.
Yeah, I don't think that anywhere elites would be at all happy with a Josh Hawley or Tom Cotton presidency.
Or even like a populist Marco Rubio, who was polite and urbane and reasonably sophisticated, but promoting this populist agenda.
Yes. So to summarize, I think we both fully expect this to get worse, and these conflicts to be more salient, not less salient, in 5 or 10 years. And again, I use looking at the avant-garde of the Democrat and Republican Party as kind of a window onto that. I know people like to kind of laud these, like Abigail, Spanberger, and these Mark Warner, Joe Manchin, these kind of centrist Democrats, myself included, but clearly they do not have the cultural cachet, and they do not resonate with their respective coalitions in the same way that AOC or Josh Hawley do.
Yes, I agreed. And I think the problem is the coalitional interests really are diverging.
Right.
And so you could argue, well, what you should do is just use evolutionary theory and signaling theory, etc., to understand this conflict, exercise epistemic humility, be more polite, and stop imputing malevolent motives to people. But the problem is, you can say that, but so long as the coalitions actually do have these very different interests culturally and materially, all of that's just fancy talk that's completely irrelevant. And I see no reason to expect this coalitional conflict to decelerate.
Right.
I don't know what the end game is. Maybe we get some kind of extra, like maybe China becomes such an existential threat that it actually causes some coalitional soldering and the coalitions come together. I don't know. But yes, in the immediate future, I see this growing much worse.
Yes. All right, so that's a pleasant place to stop, and
Yes,
we
we're
will
looking towards Blade Runner is the future we shall expect.
and we will see you next time on Psyphilopod.